The wind came in from the northwest at 11 knots, steady enough to be predictable, deceptive enough to kill a shot. Fort Pendleton's long-range training range sat at the edge of high desert, where the earth flattened into scrub and pale stone for miles before the target berms rose like broken teeth from the ground. The sky was the color of old tin. Dust moved in low sheets across the killing floor. At this hour of the morning, the air still held the cool of night in its lower layers, but the thermal column above the desert floor was already beginning to organize itself into something that would, by afternoon, make every long-range shot a negotiation. It was 0730, and 267 men had been standing on that range for 20 minutes already. They weren't waiting for a briefing. They weren't waiting for the weather to settle. They were waiting because their commanding officer, Commander Dale Whitfield, had told them to wait, and when Dale Whitfield told you to wait, you waited. You didn't ask why. You stood in your lane, kept your gear staged, and you let the morning do what it was going to do. The announcement had come 3 days prior. A special evaluation. No further details. Personnel from an unnamed assessment office would be observing the unit's long-range marksmanship qualification and conducting their own test alongside. The phrasing in the order had been bureaucratic, dry as the terrain. Nobody had thought much of it. Nobody except Staff Sergeant Troy Belker, who had been with Team 6 for 6 years, and who had, in those 6 years, learned that unusual phrasing in official orders was always the first indicator that something unusual was about to happen. In his experience, the more mundane the language used to describe an event, the less mundane the event. It was a kind of institutional camouflage dress, something extraordinary in ordinary words, and most people will look through it. Belker had stopped looking through it years ago. He was 28 yards down the firing line, checking his data book, when the vehicle arrived. It was a single white government Suburban. No markings. No plates that announced anything about its origin. It parked off the access road and sat there for a moment with the engine running, the way vehicles do when the person inside is deciding something or has already decided and is simply allowing a moment to pass before the decision becomes action. Then the door opened. She stepped out alone. No gear bag. No rifle case in hand, though there was one, plain and black, leaning against the rear seat. She reached back and for it the way you'd reach for a grocery bag. One hand, no adjustment of her center of gravity to compensate for the weight, which meant either the case was lighter than it looked or she'd been carrying it long enough that the weight was simply part of her body's accounting. She was perhaps 30 years old, or perhaps 38, the kind of face that had seen enough sun and wind that precise age became a secondary consideration. Brown hair, short and practical, no hat. She wore a plain gray base layer under an open jacket that had no patch on it, no rank insignia, no flag. Dark trousers, boot cut, lace tight. She stood beside the vehicle for a moment and looked at the range, not at the men, at the range, at the distance, at the way the light was sitting on the landscape and what it told her about the air column above it. Then she picked up her rifle case and walked toward the firing line. Belker watched her the whole way. So did the man to his left, Petty Officer First Class Marcus Webb. So did the 4 men behind them. By the time she reached the line, half the unit had tracked her approach not conspicuously, not the way you'd stare at a stranger on a subway platform, just the way trained men track something that doesn't fit the pattern, without moving their heads much, without making it obvious. The way a surveillance camera tracks movement without being seen to move. She stopped at lane 14, the far end, the lane with the longest sight line and the worst wind exposure. She set down the case. She didn't open it. She stood with her hands loose at her sides and looked downrange. Nobody spoke to her. That was the first kind of unusual. The second kind came 2 minutes later, when Commander Whitfield walked the line in his usual way, long stride, hands behind his back, eyes moving over every piece of equipment and every face, and past lane 14 without looking at her, not without acknowledging her, without looking at her, like he already knew everything he needed to know, and had decided that what he knew required him to keep his eyes forward and his expression neutral, like a man who has been given a piece of information in advance and has been told, implicitly, to let the information reveal itself in its own time. Belker had been watching Whitfield's face for 6 years. He knew every version of the man's expression. What he saw in that moment wasn't dismissal. It was something that looked, from certain angles, like caution. Webb leaned over and said, very quietly, "Who sent her?" Belker said nothing. He didn't know. But he was increasingly certain that whoever had sent her had not sent her to watch. The briefing came at 0745. Long-range qualification. Targets at 2,000, 200, 2,000, 800, and 3,200 meters. Environmental conditions would be recorded. Each shooter would have 3 rounds per distance. Score sheets would be submitted to command. The range safety officer would control the line. Standard language. Standard format. The kind of briefing these men had received so many times that most of them were already moving through their pre-fire checks by the time the range safety officer was halfway through it. Then the range safety officer, a quiet, compact lieutenant named Fisk, added a single sentence at the end. Lane 14 will conduct an independent assessment on its own timeline. All other personnel will disregard Lane 14 unless otherwise directed. That was it. In the Marine Corps, a statement like that would have generated questions. In a conventional Army unit, someone might have pushed back, but these were SEALs, and SEALs had developed, over long careers in classified environments, a particular tolerance for incomplete information. You accepted the incomplete information, you fit it into the framework of what you knew, you kept moving. The alternative demanding full context before every operation, requiring a complete picture before taking a single step was, in the environments these men operated in, a luxury that did not exist. You learned to act on partial data and update your model as new information arrived. Most of the men kept moving, not all of them. Gunner's mate Senior Chief Rick Calloway had been with the Naval Special Warfare community for 11 years. He was tall and broad in the way that suggested he'd been built for physical difficulty and had spent considerable time confirming the suggestion. His record in the community was unambiguous, decorated, respected, frequently recommended for advanced assignments. He was the kind of man who had earned the right to feel entitled to a certain status on any range, in any company, anywhere. He was also the kind of man who had, over those 11 years, developed a very specific and very practiced contempt for anything he perceived as political theater evaluators who showed up with clean boots, oversight personnel who confused observation with expertise, individuals selected for reasons that had nothing to do with ability. He'd seen enough of that particular theater to have formed strong opinions about it, and his opinions had hardened over time in the way opinions harden when they've been confirmed often enough. He looked at Lane 14 for a long time after the briefing ended. He looked at the woman standing there with no rank on her jacket and no instruments on her rifle and no spotter by her side, and no apparent awareness that she was surrounded by 267 men who collectively represented some of the finest precision shooting talent in the world. He looked at Whitfield's deliberately neutral face. He looked back at Lane 14. Then he walked over. She was crouching beside her case, running a slow visual check over her rifle. It was a precision bolt gun, a long-action platform with a custom chassis. Nothing unusual about the platform itself, but the configuration was spare in a way that felt deliberate rather than economical. No laser rangefinder mounted. No ballistic computer clipped to the stock. She had a scope, good glass, and that was approximately it. She didn't look up when Calloway stopped beside her. "You get lost," he said. She ran her thumb along the bolt handle. Still didn't look up. "This is a SEAL assessment," Calloway said. "The only civvies who come out here are contractors, and contractors don't shoot. They watch." He tilted his head slightly. "So what exactly is happening in Lane 14? She set the rifle down on the case and stood. She was not short. She was not particularly imposing. She looked at Calloway the way you look at a landmark on a map as a data point, not a threat. 1400, she said. Her voice was flat and unhurried. Calloway's eyes narrowed. "What? Wind's going to shift at 1400. You'll want to re-zero your dope for the 3,200-meter run before then." A beat of silence. It was the specificity of it that landed wrong in Calloway's chest. Not a guess. Not a general comment about changing conditions. A specific time and a specific implication that she had already assessed the atmospheric pattern, had already projected the shift's arrival with enough precision to pin it to a clock time, and had already decided that this information was worth passing along without being asked for it. He hadn't asked for it. She hadn't offered it as help. She had offered it as fact. The way you tell someone the road is closed ahead not because you're helping them specifically, but because you happen to know it and it's relevant and it would be strange not to say it. Calloway looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned and walked back down the line. Webb, who had been staged 4 lanes over and had watched the entire exchange, said very quietly to Belker, "She just told Calloway when to re-zero." Belker said, "I heard. He's going to come back. I know." The qualification runs went from 0800 to 1030. The unit shot clean. This was, after all, Team 6, and long-range marksmanship was not a weakness. But at 2,800 meters and beyond, the morning wind had started doing what winds do in high desert, acting on feelings rather than patterns, shifting without warning, hunting the shooter's calculations like something with intent. 3 men dropped rounds at the 3,200-meter line. One of them was Marcus Webb, who had been one of the top 5 shooters in the unit for 3 consecutive years. At 10:15, from lane 14, a single shot broke the silence. It was a sound with a slightly different character than the others, a different muzzle signature, a slightly longer echo decay. Then, 3 seconds later, the distant steel target at the 3,200-meter berm rang. Not like a guess finding steel, like a hammer on a nail. The range safety officer confirmed it through the spotting scope, called it out to Fisk, said nothing else. On the firing line, the sound moved through the unit like something physical, not a ripple but a pause, a collective breath held. Calloway had been watching lane 14 through his own optic. He had not been watching to see what happened. He had been watching the way a man watches something he expects to confirm what he already believes. He lowered the optic. He stood. He walked to lane 14 again, and this time he didn't walk alone. He walked with 3 men behind him, not because he'd told them to follow, but because they decided to. The way men in groups sometimes decide to move together without discussing it. She was already kneeling on her firing mat, unloading. Calloway stepped to the edge of her lane. "Lucky shot," he said. She continued what she was doing. Press check. Safety on. Magazine cleared. "I've seen that distance shot in these conditions. It takes a real sniper." Calloway's voice had something in it now, not quite mockery, but what lives next to mockery, not theater. She set the rifle down. Around them, more men had stopped what they were doing. Not everyone, maybe 60, maybe 80. Enough to constitute a crowd. Enough to constitute an audience. Calloway took 1 step into her lane. "Get on your knees," he said. The range went very quiet. "Get on your knees and apologize before you embarrass yourself further." His voice was even. That was the part that made it land the way it did, not hot, not raised. Measured. Like a judgment being pronounced by someone who considered themselves an authority. She looked at him, not at the crowd. At him. She had, up to this moment, looked at everything the way a surveyor looks, cataloging, measuring, assigning value. The way she looked at Calloway now was different. It was the look of someone who has taken a thing's dimensions and found it smaller than anticipated. She didn't speak. She turned back to her equipment. A few men laughed, not many, and not long, but enough to establish the social weight of the moment, enough to declare which side of the ledger the consensus was on. Calloway held his position for a moment more. Then he turned to go. Commander Whitfield was standing at the edge of the range 3 feet away. Nobody had seen him walk over. He looked at Calloway. He said nothing. Then he looked toward lane 14. He said nothing to her either. He turned and walked back to the scoring table. But his face, in that half second before he turned, Belker saw it. Webb saw it. The 3 men who'd followed Calloway oversaw it. Dale Whitfield, who had commanded some of the most difficult special operations in the past decade, whose face had been trained into a mask of professional neutrality over years of operations that would strip the composure from most human beings. That face had something on it. Not concern, not surprise, anticipation. Like a man who has seen this before and knows what comes next. She didn't re-engage with anyone after that. For 20 minutes, she lay on her mat and she looked downrange, not through the scope. With her eyes, the way you look when what you're reading isn't a target, it's everything around the target. The grass at the mid-range point, the dust movement at the 1,000-meter line, the behavior of light at the horizon, the way the thermal shimmer was sitting between the 500 and 800-meter marks, which told you about the thermal column above it if you understood the relationship. Belker, who had been a sniper instructor at SEAL Team 3 before his current assignment, watched this and felt something shift in his assessment of the situation. He'd been trained, as all precision shooters are trained, on the science of long-range marksmanship, ballistic coefficients, Coriolis effect, wind holds, and environmental dope. The systems a precision shooter builds are specific, technical, numerical. You look at a flag and calculate. You look at a mirage and calculate. You look at a full-value wind indicator and run the math. You build a solution from variables, and the quality of your solution depends on the quality of your data, and the quality of your data depends on the quality of your instruments and your ability to read them accurately. What she was doing was not that. She was watching the way the desert moved and listening to something the instruments didn't measure. Webb crouched beside Belker. "She's not using a kestrel." "No." She's not using any meter. No. Webb looked downrange for a moment. What's she using? Belker said, I don't know. He'd been in this community for 8 years. In those 8 years, he'd shot with Olympic-qualified precision shooters, with military snipers from 6 different countries, with competitive long-range shooters who held world records. He had never seen anyone prepare for a 3,200-meter shot the way this woman was preparing. She wasn't building a solution. She was listening for one. There was a difference, and it was not a small one. A built solution was the product of data collection, computation, and application. You gathered inputs. You ran them through a trained framework, and you arrived at an output you trusted because you understood how you'd reached it. The process was traceable, verifiable, repeatable by anyone with the same data and the same training. What she appeared to be doing had no traceable process. She looked at the desert, and the desert apparently told her something. The fact that this made no methodological sense was precisely the thing that Belker was sitting with, not dismissing it, not accepting it on faith, but holding it as an open question while he waited for more data. He had a feeling more data was coming. At 1,100, Calloway announced his own challenge. He'd been on the radio to whom nobody asked, and he came back with numbers. We're setting up a second 3,200-meter course of fire, he said, directing this at Fisk, loud enough to carry. Competitive format. Lane 14 can participate if she wants. He didn't look at Lane 14 when he said it. He didn't have to. Then he said, and we're adding a 3,800-meter target. At 3,800 meters, under current conditions, the probability of a hit was understood by every man on that range to be a function of exceptional skill, exceptional equipment, and a degree of fortune that could not be fully engineered out. It was not an impossible shot. It was a shot that separated the top fraction of a percent from everything below it. At 3,800 meters, in a gusting crosswind with shifting thermal layers, it was a shot that most of the men present would quietly acknowledge, to themselves and no one else, was at the edge of what they could do. Not as an insult to their ability, as an accurate professional assessment of the conditions and their relationship to them. She listened to Calloway's announcement. She said nothing. Fisk looked at Lane 14 questioningly. She nodded once. That was her answer. The 3,200-meter run went first. Calloway went first in his lane. He was good, genuinely, technically good. The way men become good when they have spent years at a discipline and have the natural aptitude to absorb its demands. His dope was clean. His position was textbook. His trigger brake was smooth. His round hit steel. The unit gave that the acknowledgement it deserved. A few short sounds of approval. The kind a crowd of professionals gives when someone does something correctly. Then Lane 14 went. She'd made 2 adjustments to her scope since the earlier shot. She'd checked her firing mat. She'd checked the wind once more, not with a meter, not with a flag, but by looking at a patch of scrub grass at approximately 600 meters that she'd apparently decided was her primary read. Then she went prone. Position check. Breath cycle. The kind of stillness that comes before a trigger pull, not forced stillness, but the stillness of a body that has made its decisions and is now simply executing. She adjusted once, then stopped, then fired. 2.4 seconds. The steel target rang. No adjustment. No follow-up. First round. No corrections. At 3.2 kilometers under a crosswind that had shifted twice in the last 20 minutes. The range went quiet. Not the quiet of indifference. The quiet of a crowd that has just processed something that doesn't fit its existing categories. Calloway, to his credit, said nothing immediately. He was looking downrange. His jaw was set. Webb leaned close to Belker and said, very quietly, that's not a lucky shot. Belker said, no, 2 lucky shots in one morning is physics. Yes. So what is this? Belker thought about the way she'd been watching that patch of grass at 600 meters. The way she'd been reading the light. The way she hadn't used a single instrument. Pattern recognition, he said. Not numbers, patterns. Webb processed this for a moment. That's not a taught skill. No, Belker said, it's not. The 3,800-meter target was a steel plate 60 centimeters wide. At that distance, 60 centimeters was a concept rather than a physical space. The plate was invisible to the naked eye. Through a quality spotting scope, it was a suggestion. Through a shooter's scope, at maximum magnification, it was a thin rectangle of gray-brown steel against gray-brown earth, indistinguishable from the terrain if you didn't know exactly where to look. Calloway's team had placed the plate. They knew where to look. The wind, by this point, had done what she had told Calloway it would do at 1,400 hours. Shifted. The shift was real, measurable, roughly consistent with what she'd said. A few men on the line had noticed that and had said nothing about it. The way you say nothing about things, you aren't sure how to categorize. Calloway shot first again. He was at the edge of his ability, and he knew it. Every trained shooter knows the edge you can feel when a shot is inside the envelope and when it's at the membrane. He felt the membrane. His round hit. It struck low and left inside the plate's margin, but barely. He stood up. He let the hit speak for itself. To his credit, he didn't perform the moment. Then he looked at lane 14, and he looked at her in a different way than he had looked at her before. Not an invitation, not an acknowledgement, but the look a professional gives when the previous frame of reference has been contaminated and a new one hasn't been established yet. A look of recalculation. She was already in position. She hadn't rushed into position. She'd gone through her process the same way she had at 3,200 meters, the reading, the watching, the two adjustments. But longer this time, more deliberate, the kind of deliberate that isn't caution but is, rather, the result of knowing that a problem of this complexity requires a longer solve. The crowd was, by this point, fully assembled. Not the 60 or 80 who'd gathered at Calloway's confrontation. The full unit, 267 operators who had been managing their own staging and gear and concerns and had, one by one and then in groups, turned their attention to lane 14. Nobody was talking. She lay still for 11 seconds after her last adjustment. Then she fired. The wait for the sound was different at this distance. At 3,200 meters, the delay was approximately 3 seconds. At 3,800, it was something over 4+ seconds in which the round was traveling and the range was holding its breath, and nothing had been confirmed and nothing could be confirmed until the sound arrived or didn't. It arrived. The steel plate rang with the kind of clean note that steel makes when it's been hit properly, not glanced, not skimmed, but struck with the full cross-section of the projectile. No one moved. The range safety officer at the spotting scope said, in a flat professional voice, "Impact, center mass." The analysis started quietly. The way analysis starts in units full of people who are trained to process information rather than react to it. Petty Officer Second Class Dan Holcomb, who held a master's degree in applied mathematics and who was, in the judgment of most of his peers, the most analytically precise shooter in the unit, was the first to articulate it out loud. "She's not running numbers," he said. Belker, standing next to him, "No. The hold at 3,800 with that wind shift. There's a standard ballistic solution for that. It's complex, but it's solvable. She should have taken 4 minutes minimum to work the solution if she was using conventional methodology." Holcomb paused. "She was in position in 90 seconds. I know. So either she pre-computed a solution before she got on the mat, which means she had to know the environmental conditions in advance and model the shift, or Holcomb stopped, or she's not solving the problem the same way," Belker said. "She's reading the field, not the numbers behind the field." Holcomb was quiet for a moment. He was the kind of man who respected rigor above almost everything else, and what he was being asked to process was, by the standards of the discipline he'd spent his career in, not rigorous in the way he understood rigor. It was something that operated in a domain the curriculum hadn't covered. "There's a term for it in cognitive science," Belker said. "Pattern completion. The brain stops computing sequential cause and effect and starts reading whole system states the way you read a face. Experienced trauma surgeons do it. They walk into a room and know things about a patient before the vitals are on the board. Chess players at the grandmaster level stop seeing moves and start seeing shapes." Holcomb looked at lane 14. "She sees shapes," he said. "She sees shapes," Belker confirmed. "How long to get there?" "I don't know. Long. A lot of conditions, a lot of shots, a lot of failures." "And then?" Belker watched her reload. "Clean, practiced, efficient. And then the wind stops being a variable and starts being a language." Webb, who had been standing on Belker's other side during this conversation, said, "She's been talking to the wind for years." Nobody responded to that. It didn't require a response. Holcomb said, after a long pause, "The 3,200-meter shot this morning. First round, no adjustment. After she spent 20 minutes reading the field without any instruments, I went back through my data. My solution for those conditions, my solution, which I consider reliable, would have put the round approximately 40 centimeters left of where hers hit. 40 centimeters at 3,200 meters is significant error." "She had better data," Belker said. "She had different data. She had data I don't know how to collect." "Not yet." Holcomb considered this. He was a man who had spent his career building systems, and what he was being confronted with was a system he hadn't built and couldn't immediately reverse engineer. That was uncomfortable for him in the way a specific kind of thing is uncomfortable, not threatening, but unsettling. Like discovering that a door you'd assumed was solid had, on examination, a keyhole you'd never noticed. She's been on ranges most of her adult life, Belker said. Real ranges and operational ground, every shot in every condition. She didn't start reading patterns, she built up to it, thousands of rounds, hundreds of environments. At some point, the cumulative experience reached a threshold, and the computation when underground stopped being conscious and started being perceptual. So it's training, Holcomb said. Just a kind of training that doesn't look like training. Exactly. The instrument became the brain. The calculation became the gut. From around the line, the quiet conversation was continuing in small pockets. The unit was doing what the unit did when confronted with a thing it needed to understand, taking it apart, examining the components, building a new frame. The tone had shifted. The contempt that had been the dominant register 2 hours earlier had been replaced by something that lived in a different category. Not awe exactly, not yet, but the specific intellectual discomfort of people who believed they knew the parameters of a field and have been shown a result that sits outside those parameters. Commander Whitfield was at the scoring table. He was writing. He had been writing since before the second shot. He was the only person on the range who did not appear to be recalibrating. Because Whitfield had not needed to recalibrate. Whitfield had known. At 215 Fisk walked to lane 14. He said something to her quietly. She listened. She nodded. Fisk then walked to the center of the range and said, in the flat carrying voice of an officer who has spent years projecting across wide spaces, Lane 14 will now conduct a final assessment shot. All personnel, observe. The crowd reorganized itself. She was already in position. This time, the target hadn't been announced. Fisk had the spotting scope on a line that none of them had been using, not the 3,800-meter berm, but something farther. Much farther. Holcomb pulled out his laser rangefinder, pointed it toward the target berm, and got a number that made him look at the instrument again, as if checking for a malfunction. He said it quietly to Belker. 4,200 meters. Belker said nothing. At 4,200 meters, the variables multiplied past any reasonable engineering solution. Coriolis effect became significant at that distance. The rotation of the Earth would carry a bullet roughly 8 inches from its calculated path. The round's flight time approached 6 seconds, during which conditions could change enough to invalidate the initial solution before the projectile arrived. Thermal layers stacked in the afternoon air, each one a separate medium with its own properties, each transition a small perturbation on a trajectory already operating at the edge of physical tolerances. The hit probability for most shooters, even exceptional ones, was low enough to be considered statistical noise rather than performance. Holcomb had run the math in his head and arrived at a number he didn't share with anyone. It was not an encouraging number. She lay in position for 3 minutes before she touched the rifle. 3 minutes of stillness that was not patience, it was input gathering. She was reading something. The light on the distant berm, the grass movement at 3 separate distances, the thermal shimmer at the horizon that told you about the column of air above it if you knew the language. She made one adjustment to her scope. 1. Then she lay still for another 4 minutes. The crowd had stopped moving. Even the men who'd been doing follow-up work in their lanes had set down what they were doing and turned to watch. Nobody had told them to. It was the kind of thing that happens when an environment contains something that the human instinct for significance recognizes without being able to name. She prepared for 7 minutes total. The range stayed quiet for all 7 of them. Then she fired. 6 seconds. 6 seconds in which nobody on that range was entirely breathing. 6 seconds during which the round was somewhere between the muzzle and the steel, a small copper-jacketed object traveling through 6 kilometers of variable atmosphere, following a trajectory that curved and drifted, and was continuously acted upon by forces that no instrument on that range was measuring completely, on its way to a target that most of them had found by squinting through a spotting scope and were now trusting on faith. The steel at 4,200 meters rang. Not barely, not on the edge. Not a glancing strike that might have been scored a hit or a near miss depending on your definition. The tone was clean and full, the sound of a round that had arrived where it was aimed and had arrived there completely. The range safety officer, who had maintained the same flat professional cadence through every shot all morning, a cadence developed over years of watching extraordinary things and reporting them in ordinary tones, paused before he said this one. A pause that was itself a form of acknowledgement, impact, just that. One word. And he said it the way a person says something they are reporting rather than interpreting, because interpretation would require a framework they don't currently have. The word sat in the high desert air for a moment, and then the wind took it. Holcomb said nothing. He put his rangefinder in his pocket. Webb was standing very still. Belker was looking at the target berm 4 kilometers and change across the flat expanse of scrub and stone, and he was thinking about the 6 seconds. 6 seconds during which she had known what she'd done, and none of them had known yet. She had fired, and then she had waited in the same stillness she'd maintained throughout, because the outcome was going to be what it was going to be, and her certainty or uncertainty about it wasn't going to change anything between the muzzle and the steel. He thought that was perhaps the most instructive thing he'd seen all day. Then Whitfield walked to the center of the range. He stopped, and he looked at the assembled unit, all 267 of them, standing in the sun in the high desert with the wind moving dust around their boots. The individual in lane 14, Whitfield said, is Master Sergeant Nora Voss, United States Army Special Operations Command, retired. He let that sit for a moment. Master Sergeant Voss holds 6 confirmed long-range kills, classified, in 3 separate theaters. Her Cold War record, established during an operational deployment in 2017, is 4,380 meters. That record has not been broken. He said this in the same voice he used for everything, the voice of a man who had spent his career in rooms where extraordinary information was delivered in ordinary tones. She was invited to this range at my request, to assess our long-range qualification program and evaluate our top-tier shooters. A pause. She was also invited because some of you are approaching the threshold of excellence at this distance, and I wanted you to see what the threshold looks like from the other side. The wind moved. A few men looked at one another. Most of them did not. Most of them were looking at lane 14, where Nora Voss had finished clearing her weapon and was now sitting on her firing mat with her knees up and her eyes on the far horizon. She was not looking at Whitfield. She was not looking at the crowd. She was, from every indication, looking at the wind. Calloway stood 12 feet from the center of the range, and he was still. Not the stillness of attention, but the stillness of a man processing a category revision. The categories he'd arrived with, outsider, theater, political, unearned, were not so much wrong as they were revealed to be measurements taken with the wrong instrument. He said nothing. Nobody said anything to him about it. Whitfield didn't orchestrate what happened next. He said what he had to say, and then he walked back to the scoring table, and the structure of the moment was left to find its own shape. What found its shape was this. Calloway walked to lane 14. He walked alone. The 3 men who'd followed him earlier had not moved to follow him this time. He walked the way a man walks when he's going somewhere he has decided to go, not somewhere he's being pushed. Voss saw him coming. She didn't stand. She was still sitting on her mat. He stopped at the edge of her lane. He was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of someone choosing words, the silence of someone who has gotten to a destination and is adjusting to the fact of being there. That was a 4,200-meter shot, he said. Yes. In this wind? Yes. Calloway nodded slowly. He looked downrange for a moment. Then he looked back at her. I told you to get on your knees. You did. That was wrong. She looked at him with the same measuring quality she'd had all morning, calibrating, not condemning. You made an assessment with the information you had. That's what you're trained to do. My information was incomplete. Yes. The assessment was wrong. Yes. Calloway was quiet for another moment. He said, "Why didn't you set me straight?" She considered this. She picked up a round from the mat beside her and turned it in her fingers slowly, because the round was about to do it. Something moved across Calloway's face. It wasn't quite a smile. It was the expression a man makes when he hears something that is both true and difficult. He nodded once. He turned to go. She said, "You'll re-zero for tomorrow's conditions. Wind's going to come in from the southeast by 0630. Stronger than today." He stopped. He turned back. "How do you know?" She looked at the horizon. The way the light was sitting on it. The way the dust was moving at the mid-range point. Some language that lived below the threshold of what he could currently read. "Same way I knew at 3,200, she said. He looked at her for one more moment. Then he said, "You don't kneel to people. You kneel to reality. She looked at him. He said, "Is that right?" She said, "That's right." He nodded once more. Then he walked back down the line. Around him, the unit was quiet. Not the performative quiet of ceremony or the loaded quiet of tension. The working quiet of people who have updated their models and are now doing the downstream computation. Holcomb was in his lane running new data. Webb was on his firing mat. Belker was standing at the edge of the range looking at the 3,800-meter berm with an expression that could have been called, if you were being precise about it, recalibration. Nobody asked her for more information. Nobody came to lane 14 with questions, not because they didn't have questions, because something about the way she sat still, attentive, her eyes on the middle distance, in conversation with variables they were only beginning to understand existed, suggested that the appropriate response to what they'd witnessed was not more words. It was work. Whitfield came to lane 14 at 1,350. He didn't bring paperwork. He didn't bring another officer. He walked over the way he had walked the line all morning, direct, no ceremony. She was breaking down her equipment, methodical. Each component checked, cleaned if necessary, cased in order. "How'd we look?" Whitfield said. She didn't stop what she was doing. "Webb's red is good. He's dropping left on crosswind because he's correcting too late in the breath cycle. He knows it. He'll fix it." A pause. "Holcomb is excellent. He's at the ceiling of the computational approach. If he wants to go further, he has to start unlearning some of what he knows." Whitfield nodded. "Belker?" She worked the bolt handle. "Belker is already doing what I described. He's noticed. He doesn't have the vocabulary for it yet, but the instinct is there. Give him 18 months in varied high-wind environments, and he'll be something different than he is now." "That's 3. You asked how you looked." She set the rifle in the case and closed the lid. "You have 6 or 7 men in this unit who are genuinely at the upper margin of the discipline. What they're missing isn't technique. It's hours in conditions they can't predict. They're good at solving the problem. They need to get better at reading the problem before it's been stated." "That's years," Whitfield said. "Yes," she said. "That's years." Whitfield looked at the range. The light had shifted since morning, lower now, more amber, cutting the scrub at a longer angle. The target berms were in shadow. The 4,200-meter line was invisible from here even with good eyes. "The challenge this morning," Whitfield said. "Calloway." She latched the case. "You could have shut that down early," he said. "One sentence." "Yes, but you let it run." She looked at him. Not unkindly. He needed to make the case himself. If I'd told him, he'd have adjusted his behavior. He wouldn't have adjusted his assessment. Whitfield considered this. "And now? Now his assessment is different. He'll carry that." She picked up the case. The behavioral adjustment was always going to follow once the assessment changed. That's how it works in people who are genuinely good at what they do. "You've done this before." It wasn't a question. She didn't treat it as one. She looked around the range one final time, the terrain, the light, the way the unit was distributed across the ground, the way Holcomb was back in his lane running new data, the way Webb was on his mat, the way Belker was standing at the edge of the range with the focused stillness of a man who has been given something to think about and has decided to think about it properly. "Brief Garrett," she said. "Petty Officer James Garrett. 18 months on team." Whitfield raised an eyebrow. He's been watching differently than the rest of them all morning. Not the shots, the conditions. He keeps looking at the mid-range grass. "Same read points I've been using. He doesn't know yet that he's doing it." She turned toward the Suburban. "He's worth watching," Whitfield said. "You got all that from one morning." She said nothing. She walked toward the vehicle. He watched her go. In 22 years of special operations, Dale Whitfield had met approximately 4 people who operated in the way Nora Voss operated. Not in terms of skill. Skill was common enough in this community, in various forms, at various levels. In terms of the quality of attention, the kind of attention that processed everything simultaneously and returned answers without showing the work. He thought about the 6-second wait after the 4,200-meter shot, the entire range holding its breath, and Nora Voss lying still in her lane, because the outcome was already determined, and the only remaining question was whether the rest of them were going to be able to hear the answer. She picked up the Suburban's door handle, stopped. "Without turning around," she said, "wind's going to come in from the southeast by 0630 tomorrow. Stronger than today. Tell them." She got in. The door closed. Belker, standing at the edge of the range, watched her go. He had been thinking, in the hour since the 4,200-meter shot, about the thing he'd said to Holcomb. Pattern completion. The brain reading whole system states, he'd been thinking about what it would take to get from where he was to where she was, not in terms of technique or equipment but in terms of the fundamental relationship to uncertainty, the willingness to stand in the middle of a field of variables and listen to them instead of calculating them. He thought it would take a long time, he thought it would cost something, but he had been handed, today, a piece of information he hadn't had this morning, that the thing was possible, that the ceiling he'd been operating under was not the ceiling of the discipline, that somewhere above the level at which he was currently working, there was a woman who had stopped solving for the answer and started reading it directly from the world, and who had come to a range in the high desert and hit steel at 4,200 meters in a shifting crosswind and then driven away without looking back. The Suburban pulled forward and turned onto the access road. Dust moved around it in the desert light. Webb came to stand beside Belker. He watched the vehicle too. "Who does she work for now?" Webb said. "Don't know." "Where does she go after here?" "Don't know." The Suburban was a small shape now, moving south on the access road, leaving behind a thin line of dust that the wind was already beginning to take apart. Webb said, "Did she come here to test us?" Belker thought about that for a moment. He thought about the way she had observed the unit all morning, the specific assessment she'd given Whitfield, the way she'd looked at Garrett, the fact that she had noticed Garrett, the fact that she had said anything about Garrett at all. This man who had been on team for 18 months and who nobody would have looked at twice today, who had been standing at the edge of the crowd watching the mid-range grass move. "We were told she was here to be evaluated," Belker said. Webb nodded slowly. "Yeah, think about that." Webb did. The vehicle was a small shape now, moving south on the access road. The dust behind it was thinning, spread and redistributed by the very wind she'd been reading all day. 267 men stood on a range in the high desert. Most of them were quiet. Not the quiet of shock. The acute phase of that had passed an hour ago. The quiet that follows when a thing has been absorbed and is now doing its work in the parts of the mind that don't have a voice. The afternoon light cut long and low across the scrub. The target berms at 3,200, 3,800, and 4,200 meters sat in shadow. 4 kilometers of flat desert between the firing line and the farthest steel plate, which had rung today with a sound that none of them were going to forget. One of the younger operators, Petty Officer James Garrett, who had been on team for 18 months, and who had not stopped watching Lane 14 since the moment Voss stepped out of the Suburban that morning, said to no one in particular, "We weren't training her." Nobody responded, but the thought moved through the crowd the way wind moves through a field of grass, touching everything, bending everything briefly, leaving a trace in the direction the blade settled. "We weren't training her," Garrett said again, quieter this time, almost to himself, because he was working something out rather than making an announcement. He was looking at the access road, at the diminishing dust, at the absence where a vehicle had been. He was also, without being fully aware of it, looking at a patch of scrub grass at the mid-range point, the same patch she'd been reading all morning. He was watching the way it moved, the way the individual stalks bent and straightened, the direction of the lean, the timing. He was reading something. He didn't know yet that he was reading it, but he would. The wind shifted, east-northeast, exactly the way she'd said it would, arriving exactly when she'd said it would arrive. It came as a low, flat pressure change, not a gust but a reorientation. The atmosphere deciding on a new direction and committing to it cleanly. Nobody looked at anyone else when it happened. They all felt it. And they all knew, though none of them said it, she had known they would. Some of them would think about this day for years afterward. Not just the shots though, the shots were extraordinary by any objective measure, and the 4,200-meter hit would be discussed in sniper circles for the duration of careers. What they would think about was the stillness, the 20 minutes of observation before the first shot, the 7 minutes of reading before the 4,200-meter shot, the way she had treated the wind not as a problem to be solved but as a medium to be listened to, the way a musician listens to a room before playing in it. They would think about Garrett watching that patch of mid-range grass. They would think about what it meant that she had noticed. The desert held the fading afternoon light. The dust settled. The range went about the slow work of becoming quiet again, the administrative quiet of a training day winding down, equipment being staged, score sheets being compiled, the ordinary sounds of professionals returning to the ordinary tasks that frame extraordinary moments. In lane 14, the firing mat was rolled and strapped. The brass had been policed. The ground showed no evidence of what had happened there except a slight depression where she'd gone prone, which the wind was already beginning to fill.